It's 2018 and Trump launched an economic ballistic missile.
Yeah, President Donald Trump just announced that he's imposing
tariffs on steel and aluminum.
Has fueled fears of an escalating trade war and hit the share prices of Asian steelmakers and manufacturers supplying the US market.
The goal was simple: bring jobs home, reindustrialize the nation, and, most importantly, punish China.
Starting tomorrow, the United States will implement reciprocal tariffs on other nations. It's been a long time since we even thought of that.
Trump's tariffs, for some, it's a controversial move. For others, a life-saving one. So, what was the real outcome? Did the tariffs achieve their goals, or was the outcome something totally different? In 2018, the Trump administration launched one of the most aggressive trade policy shifts in modern American history. The tariffs affected more than $380 billion worth of trade and amounted to a tax increase of nearly $80 billion. The administration targeted Chinese imports with sweeping tariffs, imposed duties on steel and aluminum imports, and hit washing machines and solar panels with additional levies. The goal was straightforward: reduce America's massive trade deficit, bring manufacturing jobs back from overseas, pressure China to change what the administration called unfair trade practices, and make America less dependent on foreign supply chains. These were major policy changes representing a fundamental departure from decades of free trade consensus. These goals sounded great to the millions of Americans who had watched their communities decimated by the offshoring of factories, but the question was whether the tariffs accomplished them.
But we have a problem with China. They've created a trade deficit, and I really blame our representatives and, frankly, our preceding presidents for this. They have a trade deficit of $500 billion a year.
The trade deficit between the U.S. and China did see a shrinkage at first. The U.S. trade deficits in goods in 2024 was $295.5 billion. This seems to be a great achievement until you see the whole picture. The total U.S. trade deficits in both goods and services have shown a surge of $133.5 billion, or 17% for the period of 2023 to 2024. What actually happened? Imports went to other countries instead of being imported back to America. During the 12 months ending in August 2025, the U.S. had a huge trade deficit in goods trade with Vietnam of $158.88 billion and $190.71 billion with Mexico. Industries have relocated their production in China to Vietnam, Mexico, and even Taiwan. Now the Made in China product became Made in Vietnam, but there was no benefit for America. There was a short-term boost in jobs in the manufacturing sector. Steel producers announced plans to invest over $15.7 billion in new or improved capacity, adding at least 3,200 new domestic jobs. Still, the overall trend was less encouraging. A January 2024 study revealed no sizable or significant effect of import tariffs on employment in the affected regions. This cost was borne by the American consumer. The total incidence of the tariff costs domestic consumers and importers in America. Estimates have shown a decrease in aggregate U.S. real income of $1.4 billion a month by the end of 2018. The tariffs constitute a net average tax increase of $1,200 per United States household in 2025. This affected car manufacturers, construction firms, and manufacturers of appliances. These prices were passed on to the end consumer. This happened exactly as economic theories would predict.
Minnesota farmers have found themselves at the center of a potential trade war between the United States and China. Hours later, China retaliated, threatening to impose a 25% tariff on American goods, including soybeans, beef, cars, and some aircraft.
The consequences for American farmers were particularly severe. China retaliated against America over the imposition of tariffs. In 2018, the Trump administration announced new aid worth $16 billion. In 2019, they further raised the bailout to another $16 billion. Between 2018 and 2019, payments of $28 billion to compensate farmers for losses caused by Chinese retaliation were authorized. Additionally, bailouts of $61 billion would be spent, the cost accounting for over 92% of funds from the trade war taxes. Consider that the majority of the funds gathered from the tariffs was paid back out in order to subsidize farmers for the effects of the tariffs. The export of soybeans to China was down 94% in 2017. Soybean exports from January to October 2018 were down 63% compared to the same period in 2017. These tariffs effectively became a gigantic wealth transfer scheme, but certainly not for small farmers in need. The top 1/10 of the recipients collected 54% of all payments under the Market Facilitation Program. A total of 82 farmers took home payments of over $500,000. China adapted instead of succumbing to the pressure from the Americans. China levied retaliatory duties on U.S. exports to China. They also developed trade ties with countries other than the U.S., including Brazil. China-Brazil two-way trade reached a record high of $100 billion in 2018. Phase 1 of the trade agreement in the beginning of 2020 involved China agreeing to a greater number of purchases of U.S. products. Most of these promises remained unkept. More importantly, China made no structural commitment concerning the theft of IPRs and the transfer of technology that the tariffs originally targeted. China came out of the trade war more determined to shed reliance on America, not more accommodating to the demands of America. Some U.S. steel and aluminum manufacturers benefited. They experienced gains in orders and a high level of capital spending. Vietnam, Mexico, and affected nations filling the void in China's place became the biggest winners. They took market share without incurring the costs of China. The losers would be the farmers in America hit by Chinese retaliatory measures, companies that would have to pay more for steel, aluminum, and parts. These measures caused a loss of 142,000 full-time jobs. The GDP would be reduced by 0.2% in the long term.
Bringing manufacturing back to America, creating high-wage jobs, was one of our campaign promises and themes, and it resonated with everybody. It was really something what happened.
This was the big promise. Factories would return to American soil. The reality? Limited reshoring occurred, but far less than expected. Mexico became the United States' top trading partner in 2024, surpassing China for the first time in over 20 years. Most of the corporations had a China plus one strategy, the diversification of their supply chain networks beyond China, but certainly not back to America. Those in the USA who had strong business ties with China relocated their production to Southeastern Asia, including Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and Indonesia. The reasons are obvious. The average hourly wages in America for manufacturers stood at $24.55 an hour, compared to a mere $2.80 in Mexico. Establishing new factories takes a long while. China's existing support structure of suppliers and parts for manufacturers would be very difficult to replicate in America. Despite the costs of the tariffs in terms of economic prosperity for the country, the tariffs remained popular. A great portion of the voting public in America was in support of going tough on China. President Biden retained the majority of the tariffs that the former president had levied. He even introduced some new ones. This demonstrated the coming together of a bipartisan agreement, a realization that China poses a challenge to their economy. The era of the ideology of free trade was effectively over. Were Trump's tariffs a failure or a success? The answer depends entirely on how you measure them. On the positive side, the tariffs piled more pressure on China and launched a necessary conversation about the balance of trade around the world. Some domestic sectors, specifically in the steel and aluminum industries, benefited. The world of supply chain management was forever altered. A more risk-averse approach developed concerning China. Politically speaking, the tariffs struck a nerve positively in voting circles. On the failure side, there was no sizable or significant effect of import tariffs on employment in the newly protected industries in the United States. But there have been obvious negative effects of retaliatory measures on employment, especially in the agricultural sector. Prices of goods also rose for the benefit of the consumer in America. The total trade deficit, instead of falling, has been on the rise. China's activities remain the same. The promised manufacturing renaissance was a failure since the manufacturing of goods occurred in another country, but not in America. There was no economic evidence to support the tariffs in achieving their goal of reshoring industry or reducing the balance of trade deficits. Farmers required massive bailouts to the point where all tariff revenue was spent. The economy contracted slightly, and jobs were lost. But in terms of geopolitics, the tariffs marked a huge turning point. They demonstrated America was ready to wield economic strength, even in the short term, in order to push back against China's rise. They compelled firms to diversify their supply chains. This has significant implications for national security. They also radically altered the politics of trade in the nation's capital. Were the tariffs in the Trump era a failure or a success? That all depends on whether you believe the end goal of trade should be efficiency or leverage. On jobs made, prices paid, and GDP growth, they failed. But on strategic pressure applied and the psychology of trade relationships, they partly succeeded. What's undeniable? The tariffs were expensive, disruptive, and failed to bring manufacturing back to America. But they may have achieved something else. They demonstrated American willingness to impose economic pain both on adversaries and on itself to pursue strategic goals. Whether that was worth it remains the subject of intense debate.